His trembling fingers found the top button first, then tore through the rest, ripping the custom $3,000 shirt off his back before the fabric could settle against him. In the flickering firelight, the most feared man in Philadelphia hurled the bloodied shreds into the flames, a low animal sound breaking from his throat. He couldn't bear the fabric touching his scar. The smell of scorching Egyptian cotton and copper blood immediately choked the air of the cavernous penthouse study. Tessa Quinn stood frozen by the grand double doors, her worn canvas sneakers sinking into a priceless Persian rug that was rapidly turning a deep, horrifying crimson. 20 minutes ago, she had been sweeping the dusty floorboards of Lombardi's tailoring on South Broad Street, exhausted, praying her next paycheck would cover the $850 rent for her drafty apartment. Then, the front door had splintered open. 3 men in immaculate dark suits had stormed the shop, grabbed her by the collar of her faded denim jacket, and shoved her into the back of an idling black Lincoln Navigator. No explanations, no ransom demands, just a terrifying high-speed blur through the rain-slicked streets of Philadelphia, ending at this sprawling, fortress-like estate in Villanova. Now she understood why. Victor Sabatini was bleeding out. The undisputed king of the East Coast underworld was backed against his massive marble fireplace, breathing in ragged, animalistic gasps. A jagged knife slash ran across his ribs, the brutal handiwork of a cartel ambush outside a steakhouse an hour prior. But it wasn't the fresh wound that was driving him mad. It was his back. The entire left side of his torso, stretching up over his broad shoulder, was a landscape of horrific, raised keloid tissue. The burns were decades old, but right now, inflamed by adrenaline and trauma, the nerve endings were aggressively misfiring. "The gauze is catching on the dead tissue, Victor," shouted a terrified man in a blood-spattered white coat, clutching a medical kit. "You have to let me wrap the ribs, or you will bleed to death on this floor. It feels like broken glass." Victor roared, his voice a gravelly, thunderous baritone that vibrated in Tessa's chest. His stormy, obsidian eyes were wild, dilated with a mixture of blinding pain and sensory overload. He snatched another clean dress shirt from a frantic maid's trembling hands, roughly pulling it over his head. The moment the stiff, starched collar brushed against the scarred ridges of his shoulder, a violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He cursed, violently ripping the shirt down the middle, popping the pearl buttons into the air, and threw the ruined garment into the flames to join the first. He was trapped in a sensory hell, his brain interpreting every touch of fabric as the fire that had originally melted his skin. "Boss, please," Rocco, the mountainous head of security who had dragged Tessa here, stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "You need to calm down. The doctor, if he touches me with that synthetic mesh again, I will throw him off the balcony." Victor snarled, gripping the edge of the mantel so hard his knuckles turned white. Blood pooled at his feet, soaking into the intricate threads of the rug. Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was paralyzed by the sheer gravitational terror of the man. If he bled out, the men in this room would likely execute the witnesses. If anyone forced a bandage on him, he would kill them himself. She was a nobody, a 24-year-old seamstress who spent her days taking in the waistlines of corrupt politicians and businessmen. She possessed no power, no weapon, and no voice in this world of predators. But as she looked at Victor Sabatini, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man suffocating in his own skin. She knew what sensory panic looked like. She had spent a decade in the foster system, watching children tear their own hair out because a wool blanket felt like sandpaper against their trauma. Tessa's eyes darted around the opulent study. On a velvet reading chair in the corner, carefully draped as if it were a museum artifact, rested a swatch of pale blue floral silk. It was ancient, delicate, and entirely out of place in the dark, masculine room. Without thinking, driven by a quiet, reckless compulsion to fix what was broken, Tessa dropped the cheap duffel bag of sewing supplies Rocco had forced her to bring. She unzipped it. The metallic clatter of her heavy iron fabric shears echoed sharply in the silent room. Rocco's hand instantly dropped to the holster under his jacket. "Don't move, girl." Tessa ignored him. She walked straight to the velvet chair, picked up the pale blue silk, and raised her iron shears. "What are you doing?" Rocco barked, drawing his weapon. The click of the safety disengaging sounded like a firecracker. "Put that down. That's his mother's." The heavy steel blades sliced cleanly through the center of the priceless, sacred fabric. The soft, tearing sound brought the entire room to a dead halt. Victor snapped his head toward her. The wild panic in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating, and utterly lethal fury. The temperature in the room plummeted. He pushed off the mantle, ignoring the blood pouring from his ribs, and took a slow, menacing step toward her. "What did you just do?" Victor whispered. His voice was no longer a roar. It was a deadly, quiet promise of violence. Tessa stood her ground, though her knees shook violently beneath her denim jeans. She kept her eyes locked onto his, refusing to look at the gun pointed at her head. "Your nerves are misfiring," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror threatening to drown her. "Standard cotton has microscopic burrs. Gauze has an abrasive grid. Every time it touches your keloids, your brain thinks you're burning again. Silk has a continuous frictionless filament." She dropped the shears and grabbed a plain, soft gray cashmere undershirt from the pile the maid had dropped. She sat on the edge of the heavy oak coffee table bowl, threading a needle with lightning speed. Her fingers, calloused and nimble from years of 14-hour shifts, moved with mechanical precision. She layered the pale blue silk inside the left shoulder and rib cage of the cashmere shirt, using a rapid, invisible blind stitch to seamlessly fuse the fabrics together. "I am going to shoot her," Rocco growled, raising the pistol. "Lower the gun, Rocco," Victor commanded, never breaking eye contact with Tessa. He watched her hands. He watched the absolute unwavering focus in her exhausted green eyes. In under 3 minutes, Tessa bit the end of the thread, snapping it. She stood up, holding the modified shirt. She walked directly into Victor Sabatini's personal space. Up close, he was a towering wall of muscle, heat, and danger. He smelled of expensive bourbon, gunpowder, and raw blood. "Lift your arms," she instructed softly. Rocco choked on a gasp. No one gave Victor Sabatini orders. Victor stared down at her, a muscle feathered in his jaw. Slowly, agonizingly, He raised his arms. Tessa stepped closer, her knuckles accidentally brushing the heated skin of his stomach as she guided the cashmere shirt over his head. She carefully pulled the fabric down, letting the freshly sewn silk lining drape directly over his horrific burns. She held her breath, waiting for the eruption of violence, waiting for him to rip it away and burn this one too. Victor closed his eyes. His massive chest heaved once, twice, and then a long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. The tension draining from his body was visible, like a tightly coiled steel spring finally snapping loose. The friction was gone. The agony was silenced by the cool, frictionless glide of his mother's silk. He opened his eyes, looking down at the grey cashmere, then at the girl who had just risked a bullet to the head to sew it. The doctor immediately rushed forward, capitalizing on the calm, and quickly taped a sterile pad over the fresh knife wound on Victor's ribs, safely beneath the silk-lined shirt. Victor didn't even flinch. His attention was entirely consumed by Tessa. "You destroyed the last physical thing I had of her," Victor said, his voice a low, rumbling vibration. Tessa looked up at him, her hands trembling, now that the adrenaline was fading. "I didn't destroy it. I gave it a purpose. Fabric is meant to protect. If she loved you, she would want you to stop bleeding, Mr. Sabatini." A heavy, profound silence fell over the study. The mob boss studied her face, mapping the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap, fraying collar of her jacket, and the defiant set of her jaw. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who cowered, flattered, or plotted against him. This exhausted girl had walked into a slaughterhouse, commanded the room, and stripped his pain away with a needle and thread. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Tessa," she swallowed hard. "Tessa Quinn." Victor turned to his head of security. "Rocco, pay Lombardi whatever he wants for his shop. Tessa no longer works for him." He looked back down at her, his stormy eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, terrifying finality. "You work for me now, and you are not leaving this estate." For 4 days, the Villanova estate became Tessa's gilded cage. She was given a sprawling, sunlit suite on the 3rd floor, complete with a Juliet balcony overlooking the manicured grounds, and a massive walk-in closet stocked with designer clothes that actually fit her. A fully equipped tailoring studio had been assembled overnight in the adjoining room, featuring a top-of-the-line Juki sewing machine and imported Italian fabrics. She was fed gourmet meals, spoken to with deferential respect by the armed guards in the hallways, and paid a retainer fee that equaled her entire yearly salary in a single day. Yet the heavy mahogany door to her hallway remained guarded by 2 men with assault rifles 24 hours a day. She was a prisoner, wrapped in velvet. Her only interactions with the master of the house occurred during the fittings. Victor required a completely new wardrobe, one where every jacket, shirt, and vest was discreetly lined with frictionless materials over his left shoulder. On the afternoon of October 15th, Tessa stood in the center of her new studio, a yellow measuring tape draped around her neck. Victor stood before her, shirtless, his imposing frame bathed in the golden autumn light, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The fresh bandage on his ribs was neat and clean. The angry red flush of his burn scars had faded back to their usual pale, raised white ridges. "Lift your left arm, please," Tessa murmured, keeping her eyes strictly professional. Victor complied silently. Tessa stepped into his space, wrapping the soft measuring tape around his massive bicep. The sheer proximity to him was intoxicating and terrifying. She could feel the ambient heat radiating from his skin. She could see the intricate black ink of his syndicate tattoos creeping up his right arm, a stark contrast to the ruined canvas of his left side. "You hold your breath when you get close to the scars," Victor noted, his deep voice breaking the quiet hum of the estate. He wasn't looking at the mirror. He was looking down at her. Tessa paused, pinning the tape with her thumb. "I don't want to hurt you. I know the tissue is sensitive to pressure." "It doesn't hurt when you touch it," Victor replied smoothly. Tessa's breath hitched. She quickly dropped her hands, writing the measurement down in a leather-bound notebook on the table. "I need the shoulder width across the back." Victor turned around, offering her his back. The full extent of the trauma was impossible to ignore. The scars crawled up from his mid-back, twisting and knotting over his shoulder blade, disappearing into his hairline. It was a map of unimaginable agony. "I was 10 years old," Victor said suddenly, to the glass window, his voice devoid of emotion, though the words carried a devastating weight. "My father was a foot soldier for the old regime. He crossed the Falcone family out of Chicago. To send a message, they chained the doors of our row house from the outside and threw a Molotov cocktail through the front window. I woke up to the smell of gasoline." Tessa stopped measuring. Her hands hovered inches from his back. The name Falcone hit her chest like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She forced her hands to remain steady, gripping the yellow tape. "My mother pushed me out the bathroom window," Victor continued, oblivious to the sudden terror freezing Tessa's blood. "I tried to pull her through. The structural beam collapsed. It pinned her, the blue silk you cut the other night. It was on her sewing table by the window. I grabbed it before I fell into the alley. It was the only thing that didn't burn." He turned back around to face her. The legendary, ruthless ghost of the East Coast stood completely vulnerable before a girl he barely knew. "I have spent 20 years hunting down every man involved in lighting that match. I burned them all. The Falcone bloodline is eradicated. I made sure of it." Tessa's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat and forced a sympathetic nod. Eradicated. That was what the world believed. That was what she had to keep believing to stay alive. She wasn't Tessa Falcone. She was Tessa Quinn, the orphan. Before she could form a safe response, the heavy studio door swung open without a knock. "Touching moment, truly," a slick, grating voice sneered from the doorway. Tessa jumped, stepping back from Victor. Standing in the doorway was Aldo Rourke, Victor's underboss. Aldo was a sharp, angular man who wore his suits too tight and his ambition too loudly. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint gum and gun oil. His pale, watery blue eyes slid over Victor's bare chest and then locked onto Tessa with a predatory, dissecting gleam. Victor's demeanor shifted instantly. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the apex predator. He casually picked up a crisp white shirt from the table and slid it on, concealing the scars. "You don't knock anymore, Aldo." "Urgent business, boss," Aldo said, stepping into the room uninvited. He flashed a brilliant, entirely fake smile at Tessa. "The Port Authority strikes in Delaware. The union reps are asking for another 10% to look the other way on the shipping containers. I needed your authorization to make them disappear." "Handle it quietly," Victor commanded, his tone clipped, "and wait for me in the study." Aldo didn't move immediately. He slowly circled the cutting table, his eyes remaining fixed on Tessa. He looked at her worn hands, her pale face, and then, for a lingering, terrifying second, his gaze dropped to the hollow of her throat. Tessa instinctively reached up, her hand closing tightly over the collar of her shirt. Beneath the fabric, resting against her collarbone, was a heavy silver pendant, a crest of a falcon. It was the only thing her mother had managed to slip into her pocket before pushing her onto a Greyhound bus bound for Philadelphia 15 years ago. "You know, Miss Quinn," Aldo said, tilting his head. "You have exceptional bone structure, classic Roman nose, very aristocratic for a girl who hems pants for a living. You look like a ghost I used to know." Victor stepped between Aldo and Tessa, physically blocking the underboss's view. The silent threat in Victor's posture was absolute. "I said, wait in the study, Aldo." Aldo raised his hands in mock surrender, chuckling dryly. "Just admiring the help, boss. See you downstairs." He turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The cold draft sweeping through the third-floor studio on October 18th was not from an open window. Tessa turned from the Juki machine, the pale blue thread still pinched between her fingers, just as the heavy mahogany door clicked shut. The two armed guards stationed in the hallway were gone. Standing inside her sanctuary was Aldo Rourke, holding a suppressed pistol. His watery blue eyes were fixed directly on the hollow of her throat. The top button of her blouse had slipped open during the long hours of work. The silver falcon rested against her collarbone, catching the harsh overhead light. "I knew I recognized that aristocratic bone structure," Aldo whispered, stepping forward and locking the deadbolt with a sickening click. Tessa Falcone, the lost princess of the Chicago Syndicate. Tessa dropped the thread, her blood turning to ice. She backed away slowly, her hand sliding off the cutting table and discreetly slipping the heavy iron fabric shears into the deep canvas pocket of her apron. "I don't know what you are talking about. I am nobody." Aldo laughed, a dry, rattling sound that lacked any real humor. He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at her chest. "Drop the act, sweetheart. I survived the Chicago Purge 20 years ago. I know exactly what the Falcone family crest looks like. And more importantly, I know what Victor Sabatini does to anyone carrying that cursed bloodline." He stepped closer, moving with a terrifying quickness, and grabbed her aggressively by the arm. He reached out and violently ripped the silver chain from her neck. The metal bit into her delicate skin, leaving a bright red welt across her throat. "Victor is a mad dog when it comes to your family," Aldo sneered, pocketing the priceless necklace. "But he is also soft on you. The men see it." He changed his entire security grid for a poor little seamstress. "That makes him weak, and a weak boss is bad for my port business." Tessa struggled, trying to pull her arm free, but Aldo struck her hard across the face with the heavy steel barrel of his gun. The bright studio spun violently. She hit the floorboards, tasting the sharp copper tang of blood in her mouth. "Get up!" Aldo barked, hauling her back to her feet by her hair. We are going for a ride. I have a meeting with the Delaware Port Union in an hour, and then I am calling Victor. Let's see if the great ghost of Philadelphia chooses his lifelong blood vendetta or his brand new pet. He dragged her out the private service elevator. The estate was eerily quiet. As the underboss, Aldo had the security clearance to dismiss the interior detail without raising immediate suspicion. He shoved her violently into the trunk of a waiting sedan. The suffocating darkness smelled intensely of motor oil and old carpet. Panic clawed brutally at her throat. She had survived 15 years in hiding, remaining completely invisible, only to be dragged into a lethal trap by the man she had just saved. The car ride was a jagged, terrifying blur of sharp turns and sudden stops. When the trunk finally popped open, the freezing smell of brackish water and heavy diesel fuel hit her lungs. The Delaware River ports. Aldo dragged her roughly into a cavernous, empty shipping container suspended just above the concrete dock by a massive industrial crane. The rusted metal walls echoed with the relentless sound of the freezing rain outside. He bound her wrists to a rusted iron bracket on the far wall with heavy industrial zip ties. Tessa's fingers immediately went numb, but she discreetly twisted her wrists, keeping the tendons taut to preserve a fraction of slack. Aldo pulled out his burner phone and dialed. He put the call on speaker, letting the ringing echo in the empty steel box. "Aldo!" Victor's voice rumbled through the tiny speaker, deep, gravelly, and laced with dangerous irritation. "I told you to handle the union representatives quietly." "I am handling it, boss," Aldo said smoothly, pacing the metal floorboards. "But I found something you need to see immediately. A rat, right inside Villanova. I have her secured at the South Shipping Yard. Come alone. You're going to want to handle this execution yourself." The heavy steel doors of the shipping container groaned open an hour later. Victor walked into the dim, sickly yellow light of the hanging bulbs. He was completely alone, wearing the dark cashmere coat Tessa had painstakingly altered for him just days prior. The moment his stormy, obsidian eyes found her bound to the rusted wall, a lethal, suffocating fury radiated from his massive frame. He didn't even look at Aldo. He looked only at the dark purple bruises blooming rapidly across her pale cheek. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why she is bleeding, Aldo," Victor said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper that vibrated off the steel walls. Aldo smirked, stepping safely behind Tessa and pressing the cold barrel of his pistol directly against her temple. "Because you are blind, Victor. You let a rat sow her way into your inner circle." Aldo reached into his tailored pocket and tossed the silver pendant onto the rusted floorboards at Victor's feet. The heavy metal clattered loudly in the absolute silence of the shipping container. Victor looked down. The intricately carved falcon stared back at him, the symbol of the men who had locked his family inside a burning building. The air in the container seemingly vanished. Victor froze entirely, a profound, agonizing shock shattering his normally stoic, impenetrable expression. His eyes snapped up to Tessa, searching her face with frantic intensity, suddenly realizing the aristocratic bone structure, the fiercely guarded silence, the dangerous secrets she had kept hidden so perfectly. "She is the last Falcone," Aldo sneered, reveling in the absolute destruction of his boss. "The bloodline you swore to eradicate is sleeping under your own roof. I brought her here so you could finally finish the job. Go ahead, Victor. Shoot her." Victor didn't draw his weapon. He stared at Tessa, his massive chest heaving heavily, trapped violently between a 20-year vendetta that defined his existence and the quiet girl who had fearlessly healed his deepest physical wound. The hesitation was everything Aldo needed to see. The underboss slowly shifted his aim away from Tessa's head, pointing the pistol directly at Victor's unprotected chest. "Or," Aldo whispered coldly, a triumphant grin spreading across his face, "I put a bullet in your heart right now. Tell the syndicate the Falcone girl ambushed you, and I take the entire operation. My union friends are waiting right outside to clean up the mess." Tessa saw Aldo's finger whiten dangerously on the trigger. Victor was completely unmoored, drowning in the traumatic ghosts of his past, seemingly oblivious to the lethal gun aimed squarely at his heart. She refused to be a helpless victim again. She refused to let the fire take him a second time. When Aldo had tied her hands in the dark, he hadn't bothered to check the deep front canvas pocket of her work apron. Tessa twisted her wrists violently against the industrial zip ties, feeling the thick plastic bite deep into her bone until the weakened locking mechanism finally snapped with a sharp crack. Her right hand darted instantly into her pocket, her calloused fingers closing tightly around the cold, familiar steel handles of the heavy iron fabric shears. With a guttural, desperate scream, Tessa lunged forward. She drove the razor-sharp, 8-inch iron blades directly into the radial artery of Aldo's extended gun arm. Aldo shrieked, a horrifying, wet sound that echoed deafeningly off the metal walls. The pistol fired wildly into the steel ceiling as his hand violently spasmed, dropping the weapon to the wet floorboards. Before the underboss could even register the shock of the attack, Victor moved. The paralyzing memories evaporated, replaced entirely by the ruthless apex predator of Philadelphia. He crossed the shipping container in a terrifying blur, driving his heavy knee into Aldo's chest with the devastating force of a freight train, slamming the traitor brutally against the steel wall. Victor didn't bother using a gun. He wrapped his massive, heavily scarred hands around Aldo's throat, cutting off his air supply instantly. The underboss choked and sputtered, frantically clawing at the iron grip crushing his windpipe, his face rapidly turning a sickly, mottled shade of purple. "Rocco!" Victor barked, his thunderous voice echoing out the open container doors into the storm. Heavy tactical boots pounded loudly against the wet concrete dock. Rocco, who had silently and loyally trailed his boss's car against orders, appeared immediately in the doorway, a heavy assault rifle gripped tightly in his massive hands. He took in the bloody, chaotic scene with absolute cold efficiency. "Take him!" Victor growled, dropping Aldo to the floor like a piece of worthless garbage. "Turn him over to the federal authorities tonight. Hand them the Delaware shipping ledgers and the port bribes. I want him rotting in a maximum security federal cell for the rest of his miserable, pathetic life, knowing he completely lost everything." Rocco dragged the wheezing, bleeding, and defeated traitor out of the container by his collar. The heavy steel doors remained wide open, letting the freezing Philadelphia rain wash cleanly over the blood-stained dock. Tessa dropped the bloody iron shears. They clattered against the floorboards. She stood trembling uncontrollably in the center of the container, her darkest secret laid bare on the rusted floor between them. She was a Falcone, the sworn blood enemy of the Sabatini syndicate. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable execution. Victor looked down at the silver pendant resting in the dirt. He slowly walked over and picked it up, his thumb brushing over the carved metal. He stepped squarely before her, his towering frame completely blocking out the raging storm outside. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently tilting her chin up, so she had to open her eyes and look at him. "You lied to me," Victor murmured, his intense gray eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. "I was 6 years old when the territory war ended," Tessa whispered, the suppressed tears finally breaking free and spilling down her bruised cheeks. "I didn't burn your house down, Victor. I just wanted to survive." Victor brushed a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. His gaze dropped slowly to the collar of his cashmere coat, the exact coat she had meticulously lined with his mother's priceless silk, the physical, undeniable reminder that she had touched his darkest, most closely guarded agony and actively chose to heal it, not exploit it. "The Falcone bloodline is completely eradicated," Victor said quietly, his voice a deep, resonant, and absolute vow that sealed her fate. "There is only Tessa Quinn here, my seamstress." He reached around her neck, his fingers brushing warmly against her skin, and fastened the silver chain back together, letting the heavy pendant rest safely against her collarbone once again. He wasn't taking her identity. He was claiming it entirely under his protection. "You threw yourself at a loaded gun with a pair of sewing scissors," Victor said, a slow, breathless, and profoundly reverent disbelief coloring his dark tone. "I fix broken things," Tessa sniffled, wiping her bruised face with the back of her trembling hand. "Did this intense Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the high-stakes drama, the shocking reveals, and the raw chemistry between Tessa and Victor, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another thrilling tale. Drop a comment below telling us, what would you do if you fell for your family's greatest enemy?